Hello everybody, and thank you for attending our webinar on tackling normalised sexual harassment and abuse in education institutions. My name's Charlotte Hadfield. I'm the head of the education team here at 3PP Barristers. I've been practicing for the last 20 years and I am a specialist in education law, public law and health and social care law. I also practice in employment and professional discipline law, which are a complement to my main area of expertise. During this webinar, we are going to be looking at Ofsted's recent review, its recommendations and findings. We're going to present some current guidance on sexual abuse, on PSHE and safeguarding from the Department for Education, and consider what schools and colleges should be doing to prevent sexual abuse, to deal with it when it occurs, and to improve their systems. We're going to look at how the needs of victims, survivors, complainants, and alleged perpetrators should be managed and consider special educational needs and disability and other protected characteristics in this context. We're also going to look at the relevance and importance of employer and employee duties in dealing with allegations of sexual abuse, the possible risks and consequences relating to the Equality Act, educational negligence, the Human Rights Act and judicial review. And finally, we're going to talk about what might happen next in terms of future guidance and policy. So today I am delighted to be joined by I've been asked to say 2 of our 14 education law experts. Sarah Bowen was called to the bar in 2006. She has particular expertise in education, employment and discrimination law. She has significant experience of claims brought under the Equality Act for disability, sex, age, sexual orientation and gender reassignment, discrimination, harassment and victimisation. Sarah is ranked by Chambers and Partners in the Legal 500, who describe her as pragmatic and approachable to clients and solicitors alike and an outstanding advocate. Alice Coverley was called to the bar in 2014. Alice is a specialist education equality and public law barrister. She is passionate about education law and children's rights. She is on the legal reference panel for the Centre for Women's Justice, providing pro bono legal advice to women and girls in need of legal assistance, predominantly in matters relating to sexual violence and harassment. Alice is currently acting for Ofsted as junior counsel on the independent inquiry into child sex abuse. And she is also the co-author with me of a practical guide to school exclusions. Chambers and Partners in the Legal 500 have described her as a rising star in the education field. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Bowen, who's going to talk about the Everyone's Invited website and then talk about the Ofsted review and its recommendations and findings. Can you please post any questions that you have and would like answered into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will cover as many questions as we can at the end of our talk. We will email the slides to you after the event and the seminar is also being recorded. Okay, Sarah.
Thank you, Charlotte. So firstly, what is Everyone's Invited? You'll have all heard of it and the majority of you will know what it is, but in short, it's a movement committed to exposing and eradicating rape culture in schools, colleges and universities through conversation, education and support, and that's how they describe themselves on their website. By the term rape culture, they mean attitudes, behaviours and beliefs in society that have the effect of normalising and trivialising sexual violence. This includes everything from misogyny, rape jokes, sexual harassment, image-based abuse, which is prolific at the moment, and sexual coercion. The concern is that the normalisation of such behaviours can act as a gateway to more extreme acts such as sexual assault and rape, so they need to be tackled early on. The website allows for the reporting of such matters by survivors. This includes historic allegations, and the reports are published on the website anonymously, but the Educational Institute is named. It was established in June 2020. However, between the 8th of March and the 9th of June this year, which is the latest figure I could verify online, there are approximately 16,500 testimonies. So far, 3,000 educational institutes are named. A list of schools has now been published in June this year. That list runs to 58 pages. And according to a review conducted by School Week magazine, there are 8 times more private sector schools named on the website. Institutions all over the United Kingdom's nations are named. For example, those named include about 1/10 of England's schools, colleges and universities, and more than 90 Welsh schools. Now, what type of issues are involved or raised by Everyone's Invited. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Alice. So these are, in short, some of the topics that are covered. So it's the full spectrum of sexual abuse and sexual harassment allegations. But also some conduct is very prevalent when you look at the testimonies on Everyone's Invited. Obscene remarks, sexual advances, verbal abuse, so terms such as slut, slag and the like, upskirting, sexting, nude photos is prolific in terms of the references, and initiation ceremonies and conduct during them, which is also known as hazing, as some pupils recently told me. Now, however, it's important to mention that these issues are not just confined to matters of a sexual nature and expand to discrimination, bullying, harassment related to all protected characteristics under the Equality Act, or even other matters beyond the scope of the Equality Act, such as class and social standing. And clearly all of these matters are of exceptional concern and need to be tackled head on in education. Now, Alice, if you could please go to the next slide and to the next one as well, please. Okay, so due to the issues that were raised on Everyone's Invited, and particularly significant issues around social media as well, Ofsted undertook a review. It was set down on the 7th of April this year. They published their plans to review safeguarding policies and practices related to sexual abuse in both state and independent schools and colleges. They also looked at current guidance, whether it was understood by institutions and whether it was sufficient. This was due to the large number of testimonials being published and allegations, particularly that schools weren't reacting to allegations once raised or appropriate in the eyes of the survivors. It was a rapid review, and the report, as you will be aware, was published on the 10th of June, which led to a flurry of media articles. The review involved 32 two-day visits to schools and colleges between April and May this year. During the review, they spoke to 900 children and young persons, as well as teachers, leaders, government local safeguarding partnerships, parents and other stakeholders. And in short, to take a quote from the review itself, it revealed how prevalent sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are, even where there are no specific reports. Right, so let's have a look at Ofsted's findings to the extent of that prevalence. So I've taken this directly, this table and the next directly from the Ofsted review. And what you can see there in ascending order is when pupils have been asked what's happened a lot, or sometimes they've split it by male and female as a percentage. Now, it speaks for itself to illustrate the prevalence of such issues in education. Statistically, females were far more likely to experience all of the conduct than males, and by considerable margin. This is consistent with previous studies already cited in the Department of Education guidance. To just pick out a few, for example, if you look at sexist name calling, 92%, so over 9 in 10 girls experiencing sexist name calling, and 7 out of 10 boys as well, so that's particularly high. 79% of girls experience sexual assault and 38% of males, incredibly high again. And lastly, just to draw out, 64% experienced unwanted sexual touching, and 24% of males. If we look at the online behaviours, and in particular the photos in the next table, so again, just to pick out a few examples, you'll see, I mean, this is a really prevalent issue. And of course, what's happened is there's been an explosion of social media, the use of social media, messaging groups and the like, TikTok. Photos are being taken on and off school premises, and they're being circulated. It illustrates the significant impact that this behaviour is having and how frequent it's becoming. So, for example, to look at being sent a sexual picture or video that they did not want to see, 88% of girls, 49% of males. And we'll see very high numbers there as well for photos, naked photos being taken and circulated without permission. And in the report, there is reference to one example at a school where boys were using naked photos of girls as a form of top trumps. Now, just to draw on these examples, obviously there is an awareness even leading into this that it was very prevalent in education. But imagine if this was happening in a workplace or another sphere amongst adults, it would not be tolerated. It would be completely shocking. You have to question, you know, why should students tolerate it and why has it become normalised? So we have a look at the next slide. So Alice, if you could, thank you. So off the back of those findings, unsurprisingly, Ofsted concluded that the issue was so widespread it needed addressing for all children and young people. It found that the conduct was occurring both inside and out of school. Obviously, outside of school conduct is particularly difficult for schools to deal with. However, importantly, it wasn't being reported in large numbers by students. Ofsted found that students, especially girls, did not want to talk about sexual abuse for a variety of reasons. That includes, for example, being shamed themselves, being blamed, being told off, being embarrassed, not knowing themselves, you know, what is and isn't appropriate. So they also looked at how teachers and leaders viewed the prevalence of these problems at school as well, and concluded that they underestimated the scale of the problem and dealt with it inconsistently. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, Alice. Thank you. So what has Ofsted said at this stage? Well, schools should act as though sexual harassment and online abuse is happening. Even if they're not having it reported by students, steps should be taken to prevent the behaviours opposed to a reactionary response. And in my opinion, for example, this could be done by educating the students, staff and governors, engaging with them, clearly labelling such conduct as not being tolerated in behaviour policies, and potentially engaging with parents as well could be an exceptionally useful and important tool. However, Ofsted emphasises that behaviour should not be tolerated and that early intervention is key. Presumably this is because of the risk of gateway behaviours, which is very much how everyone's invited has approached the spectrum of sexual harassment and sexual abuse conduct. Now, there must be clear and consistent policies and procedures, and Ofsted advocates a behavioural approach with sanctions to reinforce a culture where sexual abuse and abuse is not tolerated amongst peers. This would be on a spectrum and may include things like managed moves, internal moves and exclusions. Record keeping and analysis of that information should be undertaken, and it should be monitored as well to look for any patterns and to see whether the systems are working once they're in place. Support for designated safeguarding leads, for example, ensuring that they have that time out of the timetable to commit to safeguarding processes, and working with local safeguarding partnerships are also considered to be exceptionally important. And again, emphasis around that in the review. Thank you, Alice.
So I'm going to talk about current guidance that's available to schools on dealing with this issue, of which there's lots. And some of you who have been in front of me before, I do quite a few seminars on sex education, so my apologies for repeating some of the content that I gave in a seminar in March 2020 before everything changed, and the guidance was due to come in on the new and revised relationships and sex education guidance that September, all being well, but of course all was not well, and that has now been delayed in terms of its the seriousness with which I think it's being dealt with in some schools, but some schools have risen to the fore and are delivering full sex and relationships education in accordance with that guidance. But it is now, in short, going to be compulsory in all primary schools in England in terms of relationships education, and compulsory in all secondary schools in terms of relationships and sex education, with some health education being compulsory in all state-funded schools. And this new guidance that has come in on sex education and on relationships education followed a period of consultation over the last couple of years, and is also replacing very old guidance that you can see here behind the statutory guidance behind my head, I believe, if some of you are watching where you can see my face on the screen. This replaced old guidance from the not even the Department for Education, but the Department for Education and DFEE, as it was back in 2000. So this hasn't been updated. This has not been updated in a very long time. So just to put some caveats on that, you can see that in the sex and relationships education guidance until now, there was quite clearly no direct promotion of sexual orientation, for example, and there are some other concerns that were raised with whether or not it was able to deal properly with the issues that Sarah has spent a lot of time talking to us about. So this is, in my view, welcome guidance that is amending much of the training requirements and much of the policy requirements within schools on understanding healthy relationships, different types of relationships, and also understanding how to manage their own physical and mental health and well-being as well in that context. One of the key caveats underneath you'll see in this insertion into the legislation is ensuring that sex education is appropriate to meet the age and religious background of the pupils. Now, that you may be familiar with some of the cases that came up in the last couple of years around the No Outsiders project, for example, which was a school project which is endeavours to teach about all the different types of protected characteristics, but that also included teaching about LGBT relationships. And there was some furore in schools and primary schools about teaching that to children who were from particular religious backgrounds. Now that problem of dealing with balancing competing rights between the parents' rights and the child's rights and their own religious rights or philosophical beliefs, and balancing that up with the beliefs that the requirements, to have sex education for young people, or relationships education for primary school children, has been a source of some tension. And so that is why we have some of this caveat within the new legislation. So the reason why I mention sex education guidance is that one of the key findings from the Ofsted Code of Conduct, the Ofsted review, was that there were various codes of conduct and statutory guidance that needed to be better looked at and taken into account. And one of the key headlines was better sex education. On this page, and I'll send this link to all of these are all hyperlinks to different government websites or different Equality and Human Rights Commission pages on all the guidance that schools are in reality expected to know and understand in order to keep children safe from sexual violence and sexual harassment, and also how to manage sexual violence and sexual harassment between children in school. And you'll see there was highlighted guidance which is called the Sexual Violence and Sexual Harassment Between Children in Schools Advice for Schools guidance, which is also what features just on the right-hand side of my of the slide. And that came out in May 2018. And it is actually a very detailed, and you'll hear more from Charlotte about a very detailed guidance setting out how to manage allegations, how to deal with managing the needs of perpetrators, and managing the needs of complainants, victims and survivors. So that is the key piece of guidance for schools to manage sexual violence, sexual harassment between children. But there are also various others. So where you have allegations involving teachers or staff that are coming into the school, or if you're managing historic allegations, there is a long list of guidance there that you will no doubt be familiar with. But working together to safeguard children is one. Keeping children safe in education, of course, another key piece of guidance for those types of issues. So each of these are well worth reading over again. Should you be advising schools or working in a school, or be a parent who is interested in trying to improve processes within the school that is experiencing, it seems most schools are experiencing these difficulties with sexual harassment in the school community. So coming back to that RSE guidance, now this is setting out statutory obligations on schools. And the key thing is to make sure that the school has a policy that is made available to parents and others. They also need to consult parents in developing and reviewing that policy. There's some requirements where I've said CISS new requirement, that means the independent school standards, ensuring that there is that ability to interact with your private school parent cohort as well. As I said, there's also taking into account the religious background of pupils and their age as well, to ensure that they do teach things, but that they are done in an appropriate way and they're appropriately handled. It's also important to ensure that your sex education policies don't discriminate by treating one group less favourably than another. And there's also an important duty to make sure that you make reasonable adjustments to prevent disadvantage. So there are some examples within the guidance of taking positive action, for example, to support females if there is evidence, which I would probably argue that there will almost always be, unless you're in a very unusual school setting, that they are disproportionately affected by sexual harassment. Likewise, you may also need to do separate sex education classes for female children who might want to have a safer space to talk about menstruation or sexual harm. That would be a positive action type approach that is lawful under the Equality Act. So there's that example as well. There's also the need generally to make sure that your sex education is accessible for pupils, including children with special needs and disabilities. So a key theme of the sex education guidance that's now mandatory across schools is making sure that you are differentiating your policies and your procedures to ensure that all children are receiving appropriate, age-appropriate sex education, and making sure that you're taking into account different protected characteristics. In the next few slides, I've just set out what those requirements are on different types of schools. I'm aware from looking at the attendee list that we have solicitors who represent both maintained schools and academies and also independent schools. So it's very important to look back at each of the different requirements, firstly on maintained schools, then on academies, and then finally on independent schools, each of which have slightly different statutory underpinnings for where they're what they're required to do. But in short, there is this general requirement to make sure that sex education is delivered in secondary schools and relationships education is delivered in primary schools. So this is just a little bit more on age appropriateness. So some of this come from Department for Education guidance to make sure that there's an awareness of different stages of development when teaching about different types of issues. So whether it's about the female body or the male body, or about particular aspects of sexual harassment and harm. So the school is given some discretion with which to tailor their curriculum to children from different backgrounds. Now, this is important because each of you will be working with different types of schools, with different types of cohorts, and some will have a stronger need for a different type of educational programme. And also there might be a need for dealing with a very specific topic. So we've heard about, from Sarah, the amount of photographs that might be being circulated in schools. You might have a particular problem in your school with that issue. And again, you can then set out particular training and guidance on that for the young people in your school, should you think that that would be appropriate, and it likely would be. So this is just a little bit more guidance on primary schools, and then a little bit more on how to prevent it. So in discussing this with my colleagues before the seminar, we were trying to think of a way in which we could separate out the slides, and this is a section really more on prevention, so proactive approaches to dealing with sexual violence and sexual harms in school. Because a lot of the time we deal with the circumstances where it has already happened and we are reacting to the difficulties that are faced by various young people in schools, or teachers who are involved or embroiled in allegations against them and so on. So we often deal with it from the other perspective, rather than from the preventative perspective. But we also do sometimes advise various organisations. I advised, as I said, the Centre for Women's Justice on how to prevent difficulties like this, not difficulties, harms like this in a school. And one of the headline points is about making sure that the whole culture of the school is able to deal with issues of sexual violence and sexual harm together. So this means whole school awareness, whole school vigilance, whole school proactive approaches, and whole school training. And there is a lot of different training out there that is of high quality to deal with these issues. A number of different people have given some really helpful recommendations in the box for programs for different people. I know that, for example, someone said Michael Conroy of Man at Work does an excellent program for boys only, for example. So there are various different programs within within the world that we work in that are doing things quite well. There are, however, others that are not so good. So it's really important that schools are doing their due diligence and doing their research on the sorts of organisations that might be coming into school. And I say that because the Department for Education themselves have said it's very important to take make sure that where you're getting that resource is teaching about the correct type of protected characteristics, giving you the correct sort of information about safeguarding, confidentiality, and so on. So it's really important that the whole culture of a school is dealing with this, not just your DSL, not just your safeguarding need, but everybody in the school. The second is about making sure you have clear policies and procedures. So what happens, what do you do if you as a teacher see that a young person has assaulted another young person in the corridor? What do you do if you receive an allegation? What do you do if you receive an allegation about something that happened 4 years ago? What do you do about something that you've heard competing different information about? What do you do if it's an allegation about somebody more senior to you in the school leadership team, for example? There needs to be clear policies and processes to deal with each of these different scenarios. And that will help to navigate, if you're a teacher or if you're a pupil, what happens if something goes wrong. It's also really important, and it is embedded in legislation surrounding schools, that you have very clear and clear behavioural policies on sexual violence in schools and what is then expected in schools. So a lot of the time there is a lot of examples that Sarah gave of things that would probably be even illegal, but are not necessarily obvious to the young person doing them that they might be. So the top trumps with photographs of naked pupils, that would probably be a criminal offence of some kind, depending on the circumstances. So it's really important that your behavioural policies are up to date and include the types of things that are being raised by the young people in these allegations online, and also make clear what the repercussions would be if you as a young person or you as a teacher were embroiled in these particular offences. And it's also important to make sure that you enable safe disclosure by recognising the range of barriers to disclosure in a school. So By this I mean making sure that there's more than one person in a school that a young person can talk to, that person that is the named person to go to also has an appropriate level of training to receive those disclosures, that if that person, if there's a person who receives a disclosure doesn't know what to do with it, that they can immediately signpost to the right person to deal with it, but also still provide that immediate support. To also make sure that that disclosure can be dealt with safely and confidentially without causing further re-traumatization of that young person is going to be incredibly important as well. It's also key, I've spent 5 minutes now talking about sex and relationships education, crucial, as I said, and recognising the different forms of sexual abuse. So we have grooming and position of trust type offences, as well as the range of different harmful sexual behaviours between peers. There's also plenty of guidance about safer recruitment and regulation of staffing in schools. This is very likely to be improved and made even clearer as a result of the independent inquiry into child sex abuse. So watch out for further, I think, clarification guidance from the DfE on this, should you be involved in DBS checks and so on and so forth. And then finally, school inspections. Sarah will no doubt come back to speak about what Ofsted is going to do now, I think, differently as a consequence of their review. But the reason why I go through that list and say that these things are so important is because Plan UK, which is an organisation that deals with the rights of girls in schools, said that only 1 in 5 secondary school teachers have received training in recognising and tackling sexism as part of their initial teacher education. And they said that a lack of training and insufficient structures in place within the system meant that girls and young women who experience sexism and sexual assault find they have little support. So that is a key part, they say, of the problem. The girls that spoke to Plan UK also said that the majority of teachers were ill-equipped to deal with sexual assault in the classroom. There was a sense amongst some of the girls that the school's interests in their experiences of sexism or sexual assault was predominantly performative, as some schools are unwilling to deal with difficult topics. In some of the cases discussed in Plan UK's research, the schools only responded when legal cases were brought against the school by its pupils. So it's dealing with these difficult topics, creating a safe environment to talk about them, and ensuring that you are careful when you're looking at the different types of protected characteristics in ensuring that you can meet all of the different needs of different young people. So I'm going to pass on now to Charlotte, who's going to speak about how to manage the needs of victims and alleged perpetrators. And then I'll come back and I'll talk a bit more about the protected characteristics that are relevant there. So Charlotte.
Right, so I'm now going to talk about how you manage the needs of victims and alleged perpetrators in a situation where a report of sexual violence or sexual harassment has been made to you as a school or for that matter as a college. I've got some introductory remarks to make about this, and really they come down to this. This is the million-dollar question. So in the exclusions work that I do, where I am representing schools, and actually quite often if I am representing the child who has been excluded, it is very, very clear that the school has really struggled to know how to manage the competing duties that it has to all of the players in the situation that it finds itself in. So schools have a duty to keep the victim safe and to provide them with an education, a duty to keep the alleged perpetrator safe and to provide them with an education, and also a duty to keep all of the children in the setting and in a college setting, adult students and staff safe as well. Now, this can be a really complex exercise, and I think that some of the worst decisions can be made in both directions, where it's not really clear where that balance lies. So, for example, 2 very common situations that you can see. Sometimes you see a situation where perhaps the victim doesn't appear on the face of it to be particularly vulnerable. They come from a supportive family, they're doing really reasonably well at school, and perhaps the school is aware that the alleged perpetrator is really struggling at home or has additional needs that perhaps aren't widely known or something along those lines. And I think that's the kind of situation that leads to a victim who actually is vulnerable being told to ignore them and they'll go away, or to separate themselves, or to be given the impression they're making a fuss about nothing. And you can see it in the opposite direction as well, where the school perhaps is very obviously concerned to protect the victim, but perhaps isn't as aware of the fact that it's got duties towards the alleged perpetrator as well. It's easier to meet the needs of the students and comply with these duties if you already have the whole school preventative culture that Alice was talking about, if you have well-trained staff, if you have very clear behaviour policies and processes, and if pupils are educated about sex and relationships. So the first thing that I wanted to say in terms of guidance is that there is, as Alice said, very detailed guidance from the Department for Education called Sexual Violence and Sexual Harassment Between Children in Schools and Colleges, which the most recent edition is May 2018. The second thing I wanted to point out is that when schools are dealing with these very complex allegations, it's important not to forget that they have partner agencies and safeguarding such as children's social care and police. Obviously, it varies from area to area in terms of how joined up these actors are, if you like, these agencies are, and how well they communicate, but it's important always to remember that. And thirdly, that this is an area where terminology is incredibly important. The guidance uses victim for the maker of the allegation and alleged perpetrator for the person who is the subject of the allegation. And so that's the terminology that I'm using in this talk. But one of the things that the guidance says is that you need to be very careful in terms of how the terminology that you use, particularly when speaking in front of the people involved, because, for example, victim may not be a welcome term for the person who's made the allegation. They may not find it helpful to think of themselves in that way. So it's a really delicate area, and I think it's one of the reasons why people people working in this area can become so anxious about the decisions that they're making, is that it does feel very easy to get it wrong. Okay. So all of these situations will start with a report of sexual violence or sexual harassment, and that report may be direct or it may be indirect. So it may come directly from the person from the victim, or it may come from a third party, or it may come from it may be something that a member of staff has overheard or that somebody else has overheard. Regardless of the source, the response to the first report is absolutely key. And one of the things that the guidance says, and in fact all of the sources of guidance that Alice has pointed to in her talk, is that it's absolutely essential that victims are reassured that they are being taken seriously, that they will be supported, and that they will be kept safe. So they must never be made to feel like they are creating a problem or that they should be ashamed in some way of what they are reporting. And in that regard, it's important, not obviously as a matter of sort of generally being in a position of trust towards a child, that's important, but it's also important to bear in mind that the Equality Act puts a duty on institutions not to victimise. And so there is also that concrete reason to be very careful, to take these reports very seriously, and to reassure the victim that they will be supported and kept safe. Now, if it's an indirect report, it's still a safeguarding issue that still needs to be dealt with in accordance with the child protection policy that the institution has. And if there's any doubt about that, then the thing to do is speak to the designated safeguarding lead. Where it's an indirect report, obviously one of the things that you have to think about is why has this not been made directly, and to look at ways to look at ways of dealing with the fact that it is a third party report. A very careful record should be kept of the report, no matter how it's been delivered, direct or indirect, and it must be recorded as it was presented, which I think is a really important point, because again, sometimes when you see reports of these allegations, it's sometimes not entirely clear whether what's being reported is the way that the victim presented it, or whether what's being reported is in part the member of staff or the employee's thoughts about what is being presented. One of the things the guidance says is preferably 2 members of staff should take the report if possible, but of course that may not always be possible, particularly if somebody is coming to disclose something that is extremely sensitive and difficult to a member of staff that they've obviously decided they can trust. The other point to be aware of is that if the report involves a report of online abuse, the person who's taking the report has to be very careful about viewing or forwarding illegal images. So there's also that to be borne in mind, and guidance really should be taken about how to deal with something like that. And whenever a report is received, the safeguarding lead should be informed as soon as possible. So the next thing to think about is confidentiality, because it is sometimes the case that the victim will ask for an assurance that what they're saying will be kept confidential. And so my first point is, don't make promises you can't keep, because while there is no hard and fast advice that will apply in all cases, it's always going to depend to some extent on the circumstances. It's very likely, if it's a complaint of sexual harassment or sexual violence, particularly if it's a complaint of sexual violence, that it is going to be in the best interest of the victim to involve other agencies. And so it would be entirely wrong to put somebody at their ease by making them a promise that something will be kept confidential when the truth is that that's not a promise that it will be easy to keep. Sorry, Alice, can you just briefly go back to the last slide? Thanks. The second thing to bear in mind is, connected with that, is that if a child is at risk of harm, is in immediate danger, or has been harmed, a referral should be made to children's social care. And so that's why it's unwise to promise confidentiality. If the victim doesn't agree to share information, again, staff may still lawfully share it if it's justified in the public interest because it's necessary to protect children from harm, including the victim, or to promote children's welfare. And let's go on, lovely. The second thing, which is connected, is anonymity. So firstly, if there is an allegation that is going through the criminal justice system because it is a crime, then the institution should be aware of how anonymity works in those proceedings and how witness support works in order to support the victim. Schools and colleges should do what they reasonably can to protect the anonymity of any children who were involved in a report of sexual violence or sexual harassment. And that includes thinking really carefully about which staff need to know about the report and which staff need to know in order to support the children who were involved. So this is not a situation where staff should be gossiping about allegations like this generally in staff rooms, or where they should be discussed in another environment. It's very, very important to think about who needs to know and why. And the final point that I make here is it's really important to be aware of the dangers of social media, because anonymity, as we know, can be absolutely tanked by a social media post. So it's very important to be aware of that too. As soon as the report is made, the designated safeguarding lead, sorry, that's what DSL stands for there, should make an immediate risk and needs assessment in writing or electronically, and that should take into account the needs and risks of the victim in terms of their protection and support, in terms of the protection and support of the alleged perpetrator and other children and possibly adult students or staff. And there should be liaison with social care and other agencies as required. So following the first report, it's important to think about a number of different issues. Firstly, what does the victim want? What the victim wants won't necessarily be determinative, especially if it's around confidentiality. We've already looked at that. But it's still important to take into account what the victim wants in terms of how the investigation should be taken forward, and perhaps what ultimate outcome the victim is looking for. The nature of the allegations, so what are they? How serious are they? Is it a one-off act? Is it a campaign of harassment, or worse, a campaign of violence? The chronological ages and the developmental stages of those involved. Is there any power imbalance between the children involved? Is one much older than the other? Does one perhaps have some sort of additional need or disability that makes them vulnerable in that relationship? If one is younger, if the alleged perpetrator is younger than the victim, is the victim nonetheless particularly vulnerable because of their physical stature or something along those lines? And again, I've said already, is it a one-off or is it a sustained pattern? What's the ongoing risk? And are there any other related issues in the background that we should be aware of? These factors will differ from case to case, and the guidance is very, very clear that decisions have to be made on a case-by-case basis. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. But it's important to give the victim as much control as is reasonably possible in terms of the investigation. It's important to think about things like, has a crime been committed? Is there a crime involved in this allegation? It's also important, obviously, to act in the best interests of the child whose welfare is a concern. And it's important to point out again that could be the victim and the alleged perpetrator. They will both need support. They will both need protection. So one of the issues that often arises, and this is something that we see a lot in our exclusion work, is what you do when you have a situation where the alleged perpetrator and the victim are in the same class, or when they're on, for example, the same school transport, something along those lines. The guidance says that where you're talking about an offence of sexual violence like rape or assault by penetration, the alleged perpetrator should be removed from shared classes. So the guidance is quite clear that that is what should be done in that situation. There should be consideration about how to keep them a reasonable distance apart on premises, and how to keep them apart in terms of transport to and from school or college. It's important in this regard to think again about those factors that we looked at: the wishes of the victim, the nature of the allegations, and the protection of children in the school or college. What the guidance sort of draws a distinction between this particular class of sexual violence and other reports of sexual violence and sexual harassment. But the advice is that sharing classes or premises or transport and the implications should be considered immediately. So the institution, while it's investigating and while it's deciding what to do, should be giving consideration to keeping the alleged perpetrator and the victim apart. And the guidance does say the alleged perpetrator should be removed from shared classes. Now, this is obviously a sensitive situation. The view taken in the guidance is this action is going to be in the interests of both children, and it must be done without judgment. So in other words, it's a bit like a suspension when you're accused of misconduct at work. It's not meant to reflect a decision that's already been taken or a judgment on the alleged perpetrator. At the same time, the likelihood is that the alleged perpetrator is going to feel that it's unfair to be moved if the allegation hasn't been proved, and their parents or caregivers might be very angry about it. And on the other hand, the difficulty that the school or college faces is that if the victim makes a complaint of sexual harassment or sexual violence, and the victim is then moved out of the class, that may well be victimisation under the Equality Act, or it could be seen in that way. So it's really important to think very quickly, immediately, about what you do where the alleged perpetrator and the victim share a space, particularly if this is an offence of sexual violence, an act of sexual violence. And it's important to look at it in the round and think about all of the implications. The other thing to think about, leaping ahead to some extent, is that if this results in a situation where no action is taken, so in the end there is, let's say it goes to the police decide not to investigate, and perhaps the school comes to the conclusion that the allegation can't be proved, there needs to be some thought about how you manage those relationships going forward. There needs to be some thought about the fact that those people will continue to share premises. So how do you manage a report of sexual violence or sexual harassment once it's been made? The advice envisages 4 options. Firstly, internal management. Secondly, early help. Thirdly, referrals to social care. And fourthly, reporting to the police. So looking at managing internally first. So the first thing that it may be that the school takes the view, or the college takes the view, looking at their policies, their behaviour policy, their bullying policies. They may take the view, if it's perhaps a one-off incident of something relatively, sort of on the lower end of the scale of sexual harassment, for example, they might take the view that there's no need for early help or statutory intervention. That's not the same thing as not doing anything. So it may be that having spoken to the victim in circumstances where the victim does not particularly want any formal sort of process or formal disciplinary process, and the school takes the view that that might be an appropriate way of dealing with it, that it might be dealt with by disciplines, disciplinary penalties under the behaviour policy, perhaps by involving the parents or caregivers of the alleged perpetrators, and it might be dealt with in that way. So that's a possibility, but what the guidance does say, and it reiterates this all the way through in a number of different contexts, is that underpinning all of this must be the basic position that sexual violence and sexual harassment are not appropriate and will not be tolerated. And again, what the guidance says is it's important to record all reports, discussions, decisions, and reasons for decisions. So going on to look at early help, this is a multi-agency approach. that might be useful for non-violent, harmful sexual behaviour. So this is part of what Alice was talking about in terms of preventative approaches. It can be done in conjunction with formal disciplinary action under the school's behaviour policy or the college's procedures. Again, it needs to be underpinned by that zero tolerance approach in relation to sexual harassment and sexual violence, and all reports, discussions, decisions and reasons need to be recorded. And going on to referrals to children's social care, we've talked before about the fact that where a child has been harmed, is at risk of harm, or is in immediate danger, then a referral to children's social care should be made. Generally speaking, parents and carers would be informed unless there are compelling reasons not to. The most obvious would be if there was a concern that telling them would put the child more at risk. One really important point is that the school or college should not wait for the outcome or start of the investigation even by social care to protect the victim and other children in the setting. That should start immediately. And again, that zero tolerance approach should underpin this. And again, all critical decisions and discussions should be recorded. And the only thing I should probably add, although this is relevant also for police investigations, is it's really important to liaise closely between the safeguarding lead, the children's social care and the police if they're involved, to make sure that no parallel investigations by those other agencies will be jeopardised by something the school or college does. So in terms of police involvement, if a crime has been committed, the starting point is that it should be reported to the police, and that's the case even if the child is under 10. If the child is under 10, then if the child is under 10, then the police will take a welfare approach rather than a sort of criminal justice approach, but they will still be involved. For allegations of rape, penetration or sexual assault, the starting point is they should be reported. There should be consultation with the police about what can be disclosed to who and how the victim can be protected. If the police decide to, that's NFA, if the police decide to take no further action, the school must continue to engage with specialist support for the victim. And again, the schools and colleges shouldn't wait for the outcome or the start of the police investigation, because that could take months or years. They must start protecting the victim, the alleged perpetrator and other children immediately. So going on to supporting the victim, again, the guidance just suggests think about the terminology you're using, always have regard to the victim's age, stage, any power imbalances that exist and future risk of harm. Consider the needs and wishes of the victim. They should be able to continue their educational life as normal as far as possible. Never shame the victim, never make the victim feel like they're in or as if they're making a fuss about nothing. Tailor the support according to proportionality. So whilst the victim obviously requires support, it's important to make sure that the support is sufficient but doesn't go overboard in relation to what they've alleged. So the support they need may differ depending on what they're disclosing. And also it's important to bear in mind that they may disclose piecemeal and they may need a key person who they trust to talk to as they feel confident to disclose more. The victim may be suffering from trauma. They may struggle to cope in school or to access the curriculum. They may require long-term support. If the victim so requests, it may be worth considering a move or alternative provision if their trauma is such that they are struggling to remain at the school. However, again, I have to raise the possibility of victimisation under the Equality Act. It is very important that that is not presented in a way that suggests that the victim has to move because they made an allegation. And that's why I think the guidance says this should only be done if the victim requests it. And of course, if the victim does move, the next institution should be made aware of their ongoing support needs. And then in terms of supporting the alleged perpetrator, you have to consider the terminology that you're using, of course, and to be sensitive. It's important to balance the safeguarding issues that arise in relation to others with the alleged perpetrator's right to an education, right to safeguarding support and sanctions that may be imposed later. Consider the alleged perpetrator's vulnerability. Sometimes sexually abusive behaviour is a sign that the perpetrator is themselves being abused, and their right to a high level of support in order to understand that behaviour and move past it. Think about their chronological age, their developmental stage, and the stress that they will experience as a result of the allegations against them. These proceedings are very difficult for alleged perpetrators as they are for victims. Think, of course, about proportionality, which comes into how you would approach an exclusion decision or a disciplinary decision. And if they do move on, whether that's because of a managed move or an exclusion, it's important to inform the next institution of their ongoing support needs in connection with what's happened. And finally, just a word about discipline. Schools can discipline pupils whose conduct falls below the expected standard, as we know. They can do so whilst other investigations by the police or social care are ongoing, provided it's reasonable to do so. We've seen that the guidance strongly indicates that you should not wait for the outcome of these investigations before you move to protecting and safeguarding the children in your own institution. However, there may be some cases where for reasons specific to that case, it isn't possible to come to a rational decision about what to do with your own internal investigation without information from those other institutions. But the guidance certainly envisages that in most cases that will not be the case. The school can draw its own conclusion on the balance of probabilities, even if there is another investigation going on, even if it's the police who are investigating, and they may discipline accordingly. However, they should be careful not to prejudice other investigations or prosecutions that are ongoing. And finally, of course, the fact that the school is taking disciplinary action does not mean that they should not also be supporting and or safeguarding the alleged perpetrator. So it's a bit of a minefield, but there is guidance that helps one find a path through it. And we can see that there is meaningful action that schools can take to safeguard those in their institutions whilst they are investigating these very serious and difficult offences. And I'm going to go back to Alice now so that she can talk about adapting practice in light of protected characteristics.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. So I'm just going to touch on the protected characteristics in the Equality Act that many of you will be familiar with. Relevant to the school context are age, disability, gender reassignment, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. I've put on the side some of the statistics that were received by Plan UK about the effect of sexual violence on girls, and they are, as well as everything that you would have heard already from Sarah Bowen. These are quite sobering statistics, and certainly in arguments that I have made in cases involving schools, it seems to me to be fair to argue that sexual violence disproportionately affects girls. And the statistics support that. That's my view on the basis of the statistics that we've read and the research that there is. It's very important, therefore, to think about not just sex as a protected characteristic, but also other protected characteristics. So whether or not that young person has a disability, or the perpetrator may also have a disability, and that will be relevant for how the complaints are managed, how barriers to disclosure are managed, how people are communicated with, how parents are communicated with, how you ensure that the child's pastoral and medical and health needs are managed properly to ensure that they're not further harmed by the way in which the allegations are then managed. Because nothing's worse than something horrible happening to that young person and then it being mismanaged, further compounding the difficulties. So it's really important to think about these different protected characteristics in terms of your terminology, but also in terms of your management of allegations that you might receive and preventing allegations from even arising. I've also added, think about other things. So not just these protected characteristics, but other barriers that there might be for that young person. So whether they have support networks at home, whether they are isolated from their peers, they might be a child who doesn't have many friends in the school. They might be someone you know as a teacher as being commonly bullied or having difficulties in the classroom. What are other things that you can do to think about in terms of access to support? Also important to think about is access to resources. So some young people have a lot of information because they are on social media where there might be links to different resources. Others won't have that same access. They might not even have proper access to the internet. They might not have proper access to anything after school. So you may be, as a school, the only source of support for that young person to deal particularly with this kind of bespoke work. Or it might be that there are those resources at home. But it's really important to think about whether or not that young person even has access to resources, and also access to safe spaces as well. So by that I mean, are there physically places in the school where the young person can feel safe to be able to have those disclosures? Or are there other mechanisms by which they can make disclosures rather than through an anonymous website, but actually a mechanism within the school to ensure that there can be safe disclosures. So those are the key things, in my view, that it would be helpful to check, in line with the Schools Equality Act duties as well, is the duty to ensure that you are making reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. So I reference disabilities because the guidance that we spent some time talking about, the sexual harassment between pupils guidance, highlights that children with special needs and disabilities are 3 times more likely to be abused than their peers. So it's really important to emphasise the barriers that might exist with recognising abuse. So the assumptions being made, the internalisation of harm that might be caused, and communication barriers and difficulties in overcoming those barriers as well. There's also guidance, firstly in the relationship and sex education guidance, and in 8 at the bottom here, in the sex education, in the sexual harassment guidance, to make sure that you're mindful of your protected characteristics of sexual orientation and gender reassignment as well, and not to make assumptions about what might have happened simply because of the because of some of your preconceived views about things. So it is also important to identify where there might be tensions in this regard. And also, for example, it can be a barrier to disclosure for some boys to disclose sexual abuse by other boys because of homophobia, for example. So these things are all really, really important to be mindful of as well. There's also guidance within ISS, again, is the independent school standards. This is for independent schools. This guidance sets out, again, the importance of paying particular regard to protected characteristics when you're developing your sex education. But this also applies to how you draw up your policies, plans and schemes of work relating to PSHE, but also as they relate to how sexual harassment and sexual violence are dealt with in a school. So I'll just pass over to Sarah Cowan, who's going to deal with the employer and employee duties in dealing with allegations of sexual abuse.
Thanks, Alice. So obviously this is a very complex topic. Each set of circumstances will warrant an independent consideration, to sound like a typical barrister there. However, I will consider some general points that are likely to apply to all. So colleges and schools have significant legislative duties and obligations to students around safeguarding. So do teachers. They have professional safeguarding duties for students. And if Alex just moves to the next slide, you'll see those summarised there. Now, schools, however, do also obviously have legal obligations to staff and vice versa, arising from the contract of employment. For example, the terms of the contract express and implied terms, including mutual trust and confidence, which works both ways. And there are also a plethora of employment rights and protections, such as those under the Equality Act and the whistleblowing regime. And of course, you might wonder, why are we raising this? Well, when allegations are raised, even in relation to against peer abuse, those obligations are brought into the forefront of how teachers and colleges actually deal with these allegations practically. So Alice, if you move to the next slide, please. So broadly, there are 2 types of allegations here to narrow it down. Sexual harassment or assault that's alleged to have been committed by a teacher, and then failure by a teacher to follow safeguarding requirements and procedures when they deal with allegations that are reported to them. Now, both are very serious failures, potentially career-ending allegations, and those sorts of issues can be highly litigious for schools to deal with for that reason. It is a requirement that schools should have clear behaviour policies for pupils. They've got to be reviewed and updated to ensure that these types of behaviours are expressly covered, including when they take place outside of school. Almost certainly, most schools and colleges now and universities, arising from everyone's invited and the number of allegations and testimonies that are being raised, will need to review all of those policies to ensure that the type of conduct that we're considering today in this webinar are firmly covered by those policies, and that the procedures that back up those behaviour policies are also clear, and that staff understand them that may well involve training them on what the policies are and how to deal with allegations once they're raised. Now, it's imperative that staff should follow those policies. It's a quite common issue to have a fantastically worded policy, but it's not being applied or followed by staff, or potentially they exercise judgment where perhaps it's not appropriate, and that also causes difficulty for the school or college. Now, there is likely to be a disciplinary consequence for teachers if they fail to follow safeguarding procedures and policies and the behaviour policies. The disciplinary consequences of that, I know from cases I've dealt with, might include dismissal for gross misconduct, depending on the facts. There's a requirement for all teachers to undertake training around safeguarding issues. Alice has flagged that obviously there is a gap there in training for teachers, and schools really need to consider bridging that gap and ensuring that there is knowledge and an ability to deal with what is a very complex area, something that you're not strictly trained to do. It's not a day in, day out issue usually, but there may now be a flood of reports and a need to actually monitor what's happening amongst children at school. Where there are allegations that teachers have committed sexual harassment or assault against a pupil, they need to be investigated fairly. Even though the allegations are so severe, they may in most circumstances, if they're substantiated, result in a dismissal. That dismissal must be on a reasonable basis following a fair process, even where the evidence is very clear. And it must be borne in mind that where there are career-ending allegations, that does almost certainly increase the burden on the employer to be more thorough and detailed in the investigation that they undertake to comply with the requirements of the Employment Rights Act. And also, they should consider issues such as disability and stress that teachers may be under if there is a policy issue, a failure in the process or something of that nature, and knee-jerk reactions are likely to invite a claim of unfair dismissal. Equally, the school must balance the needs of the student with the need to support the member of staff accused of misconduct, which is an exceptionally difficult balance, and this is often overlooked. Now, where the system can break down, just in my experience of cases, is firstly teachers not tackling or reporting peer-on-peer abuse appropriately, brushing it off as boys being boys, just banter, considering it to be low-level, normal, being part of being at school, and potentially using dismissive language when it's being reported, turning a blind eye, just thinking that that's part and parcel of being at school. Ofsted is clearly taking a stand to indicate that this normalised behaviour is not appropriate and schools need to clamp down on it. Teachers should be intervening and acting on any concerns immediately. Quite often teachers, in my experience, have been unfamiliar with policies and procedures, but for those that are in the specialised positions within the organisation, such as the designated safeguarding lead. Also, they may be unfamiliar with discipline policies and exercise poor judgment when trying to do their best, but they don't have the knowledge to be able to adequately deal with the allegations that are raised. Now, potentially these failures, as I've said, is misconduct by the teacher, but employers must not automatically assume that it is a conduct issue, because often there will be arguments around capability and lack of training or lack of understanding about policies, and schools need to be alert to issues such as disability, as I've said, or stress that is quite often cited in employment tribunal proceedings as a mitigation aspect of a failure to follow process. Sometimes, in my experience, records of incidents are woeful, and it's important to record the report or observation of this misconduct by pupils as soon as possible and without delay. I've seen all of these matters and failures result in disciplinary consequences for teachers in my practice, and the consequences have included dismissal. The school, though, needs to make sure that all staff understand and are familiar with policies. They need to provide training, they need to reinforce it, and they need to keep training records. Also, they need to ensure that the designated safeguarding lead is available to deal with matters and inquiries and has adequate time out of the timetable which is reflected in the statutory guidance to be able to do so. They also need to ensure that they are approaching these matters fairly and consistently, both in terms of the process utilised and any sanction that's applied to the teaching staff. Alice, if you could just move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So clearly all of these issues give rise to litigation risks. Charlotte's going to deal with some of those very briefly that arise from pupils and parents. I've already mentioned some of the issues that can arise, such as breach of contract. There might be notice periods arguments for wrongful dismissal, which is particularly high value in some cases because of the notice periods that apply to teachers. Also discrimination complaints, unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal. However, I just wanted to emphasise at this juncture that whistleblowing issues in the current climate, in my opinion, are very likely to be a growing area. I think it's going to become more common for staff to raise safeguarding concerns, and it's going to be more common for issues to be raised to the governing bodies, to the head teachers, to the leadership about these concerns. And of course, anybody that does blow the whistle is going to be protected against detriment and unfair dismissal. So those issues need to be carefully considered. And I've noted on the Protect website that actually some of these issues are already being reported. Now, because these matters overlap with external referrals and reporting, such as to the police, DBS and TRA, the importance of taking legal advice by the institution is extremely important, because where a member of staff loses their job because of safeguarding issues, it's inevitable that there is going to be some form of litigation, potentially unfair dismissal arguments, because they're going to be put in a really difficult position. If there are safeguarding concerns, they might find themselves unable to teach. Thank you, Alice. Right, so in terms of what's going to happen next, so at the outset of this talk, I spoke to you about the findings of Ofsted. What Ofsted have also done in their review, they've basically identified some defects in the current guidance and some issues that need to be rectified. So the statutory and non-statutory guidance is very likely to be updated and expanded in light of the review, because it's pointed out that there are these gaps, especially around matters such as how to proceed when there's a criminal investigation that does not result in a prosecution, or in some cases even an investigation, differentiating between different types of behaviour, because it is a spectrum of behaviour. And the report indicates that the guidance is actually going to become more explicit to schools, because they may be struggling to follow it where serious allegations are raised. There's a lack of guidance, in my opinion, on historic abuse allegations. This means that schools are left making really difficult decisions about how to deal with such matters that inevitably need to be referred to the police. The guidance at the moment states that they need to be dealt with in the same way as current allegations, but obviously, practically, there are going to be problems there. Ofsted inspection handbooks are to be updated, with sexual harassment and sexual abuse being a focus in inspections, and there's going to be a strengthening of Ofsted's and the ISI's inspectors' ability to inspect how schools and colleges deal with sexual harassment and sexual violence, including online. So it's going to be something that's actively looked at. So schools need to take time now to get really robust systems in place. The review states that from September this year, the Ofsted inspection handbook for further education and skills will include the same references to peer-on-peer sexual abuse as the current school inspection handbook. And the Ofsted and ISI inspectors will also consider how well schools fulfil the new duties to deliver the RSHE curriculum. So there's going to be a real emphasis in inspecting around these areas. I suspect there's going to be a possible increase in allegations, both current and historic, And schools, in my view, should train staff and leadership on these issues, update policies and provide training to pupils as part of a behaviour-based approach in light of this. There may be an increase in sanctions against pupils. 5 years leading up to 2019, exclusions, 2%, well, under 2% of exclusions were on the basis of sexual misconduct, which seems very low, doesn't it, compared to the sort of statistics that Ofsted have revealed in their review. And there might be a possible framework for the handling of historic abuse reports, in my opinion, because schools are in that gap, whereas the church and other authorities have got a more scoped system for dealing with such allegations and guidance and training around that. So schools may now need to go through that sort of training and process as well. So I've spoken a lot about what schools can do, what they should do, what Ofsted are going to do. And of course, we're talking about some really complex issues that schools can't really deal with on their own. And this was acknowledged in the Ofsted review. And it's citing schools and colleges cannot tackle sexual harassment and sexual violence, including online, on their own, and neither should they. While they can play their part, it is not only their responsibility to solve it. The government will need to tackle this issue through the online safety bill and other interventions. So we may see further legislation that comes through in this regard. Ofsted and the ISI will offer jointly delivered training on inspecting safeguarding, including peer-on-peer abuse, and they will also be offering a series of webinars and events for schools and colleges to discuss the findings of the review. So I think a lot's going to happen in a very short space of time. Over to Alice.
So something else I wanted to mention as well, there has been an inquiry going on for the last 4 or 5 years called the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse. There are a huge number of reports and research documents that you can find on the website, as well as specific inquiries into big topics. So one of them that I was involved in last year when I was instructed by Ofsted as the junior counsel was an inquiry into sexual abuse, in particular in residential schools. There will be a report about their findings from that later on this year, where they are likely to make a huge range of recommendations to change statutory guidance from the government side, and also to make recommendations. It'd be very interesting to see if, for example, the inquiry supports the mandatory reporting recommendation that has been talked about by various victim rights groups as a way of tackling sexual abuse, given the prevalence and given the lack of often the lack of dealing with it appropriately. So that is a key thing I would recommend all of you to look out for. But also there are discrete pieces of research that have been done, in particular on children in the care system, on children and adults, and the impact of reparations, how that has helped affect the way in which they have dealt with abuse in the past. As well as, of course, a number of different investigations into other organisations, not just in schools, but in the church, in other religious organisations, in terms of the government itself, in terms of the internet. There's a huge range. It's worth looking at their website to see the research that they have done there, and there'll be, as I said, further reports that you will see coming out either this year and probably into 2022 as a result of the oral evidence that closed just in December. So now I'm just going to pass over to Charlotte to just touch on the different types of legal risks that we are starting to see coming up in this area.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alice. I'm going to start by talking about the Equality Act side of things. I've already talked in my earlier presentation about the potential risks in terms of being potentially facing a claim for victimisation if a victim is treated detrimentally or in some other way unfavourably in circumstances where that can be connected to making a complaint under the Equality Act or doing a protected act under the Equality Act. There are also risks, I think, in terms of obviously claims for sexual harassment. The Act makes potentially makes the setting liable for certainly for victimisation. In terms of Other protected characteristics, Alice has talked about how those can intersect. And of course, there's always the danger of, for example, having a track record of dealing with allegations where the complaint is made by, let's say, by male complainants one way, and then perhaps treating allegations made by female complainants another way, which can give rise to straightforward claims for direct discrimination or indirect discrimination. So it's always really important to think about the equality implications of the decisions that are being made and the choices that are being made when these allegations are being investigated and looked at. In terms of the Human Rights Act, possibly slightly less unusual to see Human Rights Act claims in this context, but articles that might be triggered include Article 3, the right to freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment, which is an absolute right. Article 8, the right to respect for family and private life, which is a qualified right, but does include a duty to protect individuals' physical and psychological integrity. Article 14, which requires that all of the rights and freedoms set out in the Act have to be protected and applied without discrimination. And Protocol 1, Article 2, which protects the right to an effective education. And being subjected to it, sexual violence or sexual harassment could breach any or all of those rights depending on the nature of the conduct and the circumstances. In terms of the employment issues that Sarah was talking about, risks of claims by employees, which could be under the Equality Act or could be under broader employment legislation, potential risks of judicial review claims, and I'm going to talk about one of those in a minute, and perhaps claims for educational negligence or for personal injury caused by educational negligence, and bearing in mind also that a personal injury claim can be brought in conjunction with an Equality Act claim. Just going to the next slide, Alice. Yeah, in terms of judicial review challenges, there's a really interesting judicial review wending its way through the, I think it's at the pre-action stage at the moment, and the pre-action, the letter before claim has been published online. But essentially, this is a claim against the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, and the complaint broadly is that although the ICO has expressly recognised issues of real concern around the processing of children's data by pornographic websites, she's recognised that as being within the scope of her existing regulatory functions, but, says the letter before claim, has failed to take any steps or any meaningful steps to address that concern. So that's one very interesting judicial review, which is looking to strengthen, I think, the protection of children in this jurisdiction from pornographic websites. And I think that brings us to the end of this seminar. We've overrun a little, which was slightly inevitable, I think, given the topic, which is very difficult to know how to stop talking about it once you've started. But we will take questions if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask.
Charlotte, we've got a few on the chat box. Perhaps if we pick those up, we'll start with one that Alice has picked up to discuss. So, what is your view on whether or not it is necessary for specialist training in joint child protection investigation, AB intervening of children and young people when investigating allegations, reports of sexual abuse, harassment, whether or not taking place at school? And that's from Neil Russell.
So it's a really important question. I think that the main thing I would emphasise is the slides that we gave information about the role of the police. It's really important that even though it is key to do good investigations, that they don't interfere with police roles. So I would say that point as the first point, that the police will have a key role. But ABEs, in terms of achieving best evidence, there might be good training out there, not necessarily from a police investigation perspective, but on how to deal with allegations when they are made and how to achieve best evidence, how to get the best type of information from a young person whilst also protecting them and meeting their needs. So I'm sure that there are other participants here who may have recommendations where that might be training in that respect. And again, it might be something that we can also provide specific training on as well. I know that I've advised some schools on how best to interview, how to deal with, in particular, with children with disabilities when they are themselves accused of sexual harm. So yes, I agree with the need for specialist training, but I would also be cautious about replacing the role of the police when they have a very the more superior role, I think, in these circumstances. So I hope that answers your question, Mr. Russell.
Brilliant. You said thank you to you, Alice. So there you go. There's one here from Helena Marsh that I think is just important to pick out. Do you advise a policy specifically addressing dealing with harassment, or could this sit within the anti-bullying policy? I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly seen it done both ways. Yeah. But the bottom line for me is that these types of behaviours need to be included in the policies. And actually, I think there is an argument to have a separate policy dealing particularly with cyberbullying, the sharing of nudes and that sort of thing, but also to have very clear guidance about terminology, harassment, sexual assault and conduct within the behaviour policies expressly, rather than sort of bunged in amongst everything else in a pre-existing policy. I don't know if Charlotte or Alice have got a view on that.
So from my perspective, I think, like you say, I've seen it done both ways. I think for myself, I'm not sure I have a preference one way or the other. I can certainly see a kind of, at the very least, a kind of symbolic, more than symbolic, a kind of functional message in having a dedicated policy, because that perhaps says we take this very seriously. I think if you are going to have a separate policy, the thing to bear in mind is you will need to reference it also in your behaviour policy, because you will want to attach disciplinary sanctions to it. And so it's really important that what you put in your behaviour policy is consistent with what you've got in your separate policy. So I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way to do it. I think there is value in having, if you like, a separate mission statement about harassment, because then it becomes a statement of intent and a statement of zero tolerance as well. But I do think you need to make very sure that it cross-references properly with your behaviour policy.
Yeah, what do you guys think about training on these issues, or talks to students? I mean, what the Ofsted report or review emphasises is that this needs to be tackled by the horns, and they really should be dealing with behaviours of students early on. I mean, I've certainly gone in and done that at schools, and from speaking to the students, there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect there, that they don't always understand what appropriate behaviour is. There definitely is an issue about it being normalised. So if, for example, they're using sexual terminology, calling each other a slag, a bitch, that sort of thing, that's normal to them because that's the environment that they're in. They don't necessarily see it as sexual harassment or inappropriate. Same with photos, although to a lesser degree, and other types of conduct. And it seems that if you engage with them, that might actually help to stem the extent of the issue in schools, colleges, and even universities. What do you think about that?
I mean, I spent maybe 15 minutes talking about the importance of sex education. I think that's the key place that we can work on to try and nip this in the bud properly, and to teach boys not to assault girls. It's as straightforward as that. There are some good organisations out there that do train, who work with boys in particular to deal with issues of toxic masculinity, homophobia, sexism, and so on. I mentioned Men at Work, which was the Michael Conroy organisation. There are certainly others as well that deal specifically with consent. Some work really well on that, and I think Schools Consent Project is another one that does some very simple and straightforward work using the T analogy and other such kind of work on consent to sort of force dialogue between young people about this issue, rather than, as you say, normalising language and normalising behaviour. So there are, I think that's the best kind of way to approach it. But this is all part of a much wider patriarchal society, isn't it? So my personal view is that we need to tackle that first, and that's a much wider question, I think, than the law. But in a legal sense, good training is key under sex education guidance.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think the only thing I would add is the earlier you get it. I mean, I'm not a fan of mystification for small children. I think the moment children are old enough to start asking questions about this stuff, they're old enough to hear, like a suitably phrased answer. And it's possible to be accurate without either being really inappropriately sensationalist or pointlessly obtuse, so they don't really know what you're talking about. And I think the earlier you do that, and the more openly you do that, the more likely it is that we will see a reduction in this sort of behaviours when people get to teenagerdom. And I will say, I found the Everybody's Invited testimonies very moving and also very sad, because I have to say, I thought things would be better 25 years after I was at school than they were when I was at school, and it looks like they're not.
Well, that's the sad truth of it, isn't it? It's something I was saying just earlier on, actually, to a colleague, that not a lot has changed since I was at school, really. So I think that there's a lot to be done in what's going to be a very short period of time. It's being referred to as the Me Too movement in education in the press. One question that came through that I actually answered, so you guys might not have seen it, is whether Ofsted might have missed a trick 5 years ago, whether there's been a delay in reacting to this issue in schools. My view was that it's very difficult to say that about Ofsted. There's been a lot of guidance around these issues. It just hasn't been effective in reducing the issues around sexual harassment. And also, in my view, it's at a time when there's been an explosion of social media, and perhaps the guidance is a bit out of date with the reality of what's happening in schools arising from issues such as nudes and that sort of thing. Have you guys got a view on that?
I'm currently instructed by Ofsted, so I'll keep
No, I know Alice might not want to comment there.
I don't have a specific criticism to make of Ofsted in that regard. I think there is a general problem, and I'm quite happy to say this is in accordance with my own personal experience as a woman, both at school and at work, that where sexual harassment happens, generally speaking, the people around you will know that it's happening. And so it's like, who do you disclose this to? If everybody knows that it's happening, if they can see that it's happening and they're not doing anything about it, or what they're doing. So, for example, I've seen situations in workplaces where there is a known person who is a problem when they get drunk, or their behaviour becomes problematic when they're in a certain situation, and that people will try and move them away. They'll try and walk people home, but what they don't do is just kind of get that person into a corner and say, you know what, you can't behave like this. So I think that there is a general, everybody's sort of going, oh my God, there's so much sexual harassment around, we didn't know. And I'm sort of thinking, well, I think we did.
That's what's so interesting, I think, about the mandatory reporting, and how that will be dealt with by ICSA. It's really interesting to see the victim groups' representations about it, and there's definitely some support from the institutions as well for a requirement in law to report if something like that is seen, and there would then be penalties for failing to report, rather than just sort of letting people, as you say, kind of get away with it when it's a known behaviour that someone acts in an appropriate way with sixth form pupils or whatever. So that would be really interesting if that's taken up, and I'm kind of looking forward to seeing the discussions about that. Should there be recommendations in that way? So one of the big kind of closing questions, maybe because of the time, is that one of the questions has been asked about, what does the panel think is the most effective action that primary schools can take to help prevent the development of harmful attitudes that we know lead to sexual harassment and abuse? In a sense, we've already answered that when we talked about sexual PSHE and so on. I don't know if either of you have any other things that you would add to the list of things that could be helped to prevent the development of harmful attitudes, rather than necessarily just behaviours, but attitudes themselves.
I think just sort of approach, for me, I think it's about you approach, all of these things should be approached on the basis that you're really, in the broader sense, you are actually trying to protect and do the best thing for everybody. So if you wherever you are in the process, whether you're talking about preventative stuff or whether you're in the middle of an investigation, if you take the approach that by confronting this behaviour when it occurs, and I appreciate that there will be times when it's not proved conduct. That's the point that somebody's made in the comments, what about false allegations? And I think you've talked about. But broadly, I think that if you approach all of these questions saying to yourself that you're going to investigate them fearlessly but fairly, or that you will be confronting these issues with very young children when you're educating them about relationships fearlessly but fairly and appropriately, ultimately you are protecting everybody. You're not just protecting one side of the equation or the other, you're protecting everybody.
I also think that there's, it's not just with the pupils, but there needs to be this education amongst staff as well. BBC Panorama, you might have seen it, in 2019 looked, they did a Freedom of Information request and looked at how many reports there had been of sexual misconduct in primary schools, and it actually increased between 2013 and 2017 from about 4,500 to nearly 8,000. And this included 2,625 peer-on-peer sexual assaults, and 225 of those were rapes, and that's in primary school settings. And I think that there is a slight perception that this is a secondary school issue, a college and a university issue. And I think it, you know, my view is to speak to the children, to educate them, to encourage these sorts of discussions, and to clamp down on the conduct early is critical in changing attitudes. I had one quite sad exchange with a teenager recently where she said, well, why do boys have this view? Is it society? Is it television? Is it social media? Or is it their upbringing? And I couldn't really answer the question because I think it's a bit of everything, isn't it? It's a really difficult thing to have to answer because I don't understand why it's happening. But I also want to just pick out that we've spent a lot of time obviously speaking about girls because statistically they're more likely to experience this sort of behaviour. That was clear from Ofsted's review. It was clear before, it's cited in the Department of Education guidance. But also the Ofsted review does reveal that boys are in significant percentages also being exposed to this sort of behaviour.
That's right, especially in residential schools. There's a much higher proportion of boys are victims of sexual violence by male perpetrators in residential schools. The proportions are higher. It might be because there are more single-sex boys' schools, but there is also something quite interesting about that type of ethos and environment that may propagate that sort of misconduct as well. So it's really important to look at this, as you say, from all the different dimensions, and not ignore that obviously boys can experience it as well, and that they need to be supported as well in that context. As I said, ensuring that they have their needs met as well. So that's a really important point. Brilliant. I think that there have been a couple of other questions, but I'm mindful of the time. So I don't know if anyone has had any really urgent things they wanted to mention. The video is being recorded. So we're going to publish the recording, and we're going to send out a copy of our slides as well to everybody who has attended. And then I know that some people wanted to publish that further. We normally publish our recordings on YouTube as well, so you can send on this recording to other people in schools and wherever. If anybody is working with a school that wants any additional training or any further advice, we're all here. We're all really interested and passionate in this topic. So if you want to get in touch with any of us at all after this, you, I think, have our email addresses, or they'll be popped into the chat in a moment, and you can contact us at any time as well.
Yep, please let us keep talking about this.
Yeah. Well, all right then. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Should we look at the details in the chat and then?
Yes, I'll pop those in. I'll mute myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.